And we're back with more Block Tales. For those who might not know, Block Tales Part 2 demo released relatively recently, and because I had such a glowing review of the first demo, I figured I've pretty much got absolutely no excuse but to return and play the second part. The thing about Block Tales is that it's one of probably 2, maybe 3 games on the entire platform where if someone came to me and told me, hey, this game updated, they did X, Y, and Z, I would almost certainly actually return to play it again. The other 2 games being Combat Initiation and Deepwoken. When it comes to Block Tales the first time around, I had pretty much nothing but good things to say about it. And the second time around, well, it's mostly the same, although there were some negative things I ran into this time around, as well as some stuff that I talked about last time that weren't addressed, which is unfortunate. As for improvements from the first demo to the second, I think the most notable one is definitely when it comes to combat and the amount of options you have in combat. I think a lot of this stems from it just being the early game, but when it came to the first demo of Block Tales and the first section of the game, it feels very limiting on what you can use and how you can interact with the environment. It seemed to me, at the very least, that there were basically 2 strategies that you could employ. One where you tried to buff yourself up and brute force damage through the enemies, and one where you played the long game, where you would block in order to regain your SP, and then use healing moves to keep healing yourself until you figured out the enemy's moveset. Then it was pretty much smooth sailing from there. I went with the latter option just because I thought it would be more interesting to play, and it definitely was, but it also made fights take significantly longer, something that I didn't have a problem with. Now jumping into the second part of Block Tales, and we have a myriad of new things that make the gameplay spiced up a fair bit. Within the very first new town that you get to in the game, you get the option of buying either the slingshot or the rocket launcher. You could technically buy both if you somehow amassed 800 tickets throughout playing, but that seems very unlikely. The slingshot and the rocket launcher are options that can replace either your sword or your bouncing ball. The slingshot appears to do more damage but is unable to penetrate armor. It seemed like a kind of questionable pick, and when I read the description for the rocket launcher, that's when I really knew that that's what I wanted. The rocket launcher not only does splash damage without having to use any SP, but it also lowers the defense of the target that you hit. Seeing as I was using a build that was basically entirely designed around stalling and reduced my damage by 1 because I was using a healing card, sometimes I would run into enemies that had defense ratings that meant that if I attacked them, I would literally do 0 damage. Obviously, being able to lower their defense was really helpful in this regard, because it meant that I could consistently do damage. Not only that, but depending on who I targeted, I could do splash damage to those around them, which was also super handy. The trade-off is, of course, the fact that while using the rocket launcher, I don't have access to any of the bouncy ball abilities, things like being able to shrink down enemies to reduce the amount of damage they do. But granted, at this point in the game, I was rarely using the bouncy ball anyway, so I decided I'm going with the rocket launcher, and it paid off in droves. Now granted, I do kind of wish that this choice was harder to make, and I think that it would have been harder to make had the game's bouncy ball abilities been more powerful. Being able to reduce the enemy's damage by half is pretty handy, but it doesn't last very long, and a lot of the time it feels like doing damage is just more important. That, or figuring out the enemy's attack so you don't take damage in the first place. And the line bounce ability for the ball is just objectively worse than the rocket launcher, because it costs you SP to use and does basically the same thing and requires more skill to use. So when it comes to that move, the rocket launcher is just sort of a direct upgrade, and while that sort of makes sense because you're buying it with 400 tickets, it's also weird because, well, why would you have something in the game that just sort of negates itself, right? Part 2 of Block Tales also introduces something that I didn't even realize was either predominantly missing or completely missing from the first part, and that's status effects. Yeah, I don't know how I didn't notice this, considering that status effects are usually a huge staple of these types of games, but with the introduction of status effects, you have the potential for much lower lows if you're getting constantly affected by status effects, but also much higher highs if you're able to block the attacks that the status effects are tied to and inflict status effects of your own. What do I mean by this? Well, if you're not successfully able to block the headbutt attack of these helmeted noob enemies, then they'll inflict you with dizzy. And while you're dizzy, you have the potential of skipping your turn and being unable to attack. If you're able to block or parry the attack, you don't get affected at all. This means that while fighting enemies, you need to be on the lookout for these enemies and make damn sure that you're blocking or parrying specific attacks and not screwing up, as it can really hurt you in the long run if you go to try to heal yourself, for example, and it skips your turn while you're low on health. Status effects are also unbelievably fun and helpful to use on the giving end. My personal favorite was when I unlocked the rocket boots, which are able to inflict a burn effect on the enemy that you hit. You can probably guess that with my stalling build, being able to inflict burn damage and then just stall while the enemy burns is really, really good. I would almost argue maybe too good, because difficulty is a conversation that we'll be getting into in just a moment. Overall, it feels like the gameplay improved a fair bit, and I'm a pretty big fan of the direction that it's going, although the balance is a little bit out of whack. Now, I touched briefly on difficulty, but I want to get a little bit more in depth on it, because it felt to me like the game's difficulty almost took a nosedive, and I think a lot of that stemmed from just a huge increase in the amount of options I had versus the amount of options that the enemies had remaining mostly static. I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. After all, there is a modifier that you can put on called hard mode that just makes the game harder, so it's not necessarily bad that I felt like the game was kind of getting easier, because if I really wanted to make it harder, that option is there. That being said, I think the real eye-opener for me was definitely the re-battle with the Ice King boss. In the new airport area of the game, if you head into one of the buildings and speak with a person there, you'll have the opportunity to re-fight bosses that you've fought before. In my case, since I was just jumping back into the game again, I decided no better way to re-warm up than to throw myself into the blender and fight what is definitely the hardest boss in the entirety of Block Tales still. I jumped on and refought the Ice King, and he absolutely kicked my ass over and over and over again. I lost to this guy like 5 times in a row, and I was just sitting there like, holy shit, this guy's hard as balls. I'm gonna get obliterated in this next section. And then absolutely nothing killed me. I didn't die once at any point during the entire rest of the demo, which was really surprising. I think a lot of it stems from the Ice King's usage of minions, which block you from being able to do damage to him, as well as the fact that he has a heal ability, which not only affects him, but also his teammates, which can drag the fight on longer and longer. It could also stem from the fact that that specific strategy works really well against the build that I was using, so maybe people who are just bum rushing through and trying to increase their damage as much as possible, maybe those people are able to just roll the Ice King, and the reason it's hard for me is specifically because of the build. I'm not sure. But either way, like I said, the difficulty felt a little bit lacking. I'm hoping that it further increases as the game goes on, because a solid difficulty curve is something that makes or breaks these sorts of games. As for the world building and actual story itself, I also was relatively disappointed here, and that's a real big shame. I don't know how else to explain it other than it felt sort of rushed, and we never got to know any of the characters that it seems like the game was trying to make us care about. I'm gonna get into spoilers, so if you don't want spoilers more than has already been spoiled, then, well, I'll see you soon. Basically, the big character arc that we're following in this section of the game is the relationship of the mayor of a town that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, and their son, the Griefer. Now, the problem here is that we literally know nothing about the mayor, and we literally know nothing about the Griefer. I can't even remember if it's supposed to be a big reveal that the Griefer is the son of the mayor, but even if it was a big reveal, it would have absolutely no weight and no impact because we don't know these people, so we don't care about them. At the very end of the story, there's supposed to be this emotional moment where the father is caring for the son, and this might make sense in some sort of cliche story way if we were supposed to find out at some point that the father didn't care about the son, but there was some sort of noble reason why. You know, you've seen those cliches 100 times if you've paid attention to media at all for the last, 40 years. But there's none of that here. So the care that the father has for the son after he transforms himself into a big old plant monster doesn't hit home at all because, well, we had no story to follow. This random guy that was an enemy turned himself into a plant monster and we fought him. And that's it. I don't know, maybe I was just expecting too much from a Roblox game, and so that's a failing on my part because we're relying on the storytelling of random people who are absolutely not writers, but I don't know. It just fell flat, it felt rushed, and I was a little bit disappointed. Overall, at the end of the day, the Blocktails Demo 2 is a bit of a mixed bag. There were some other things that I didn't really touch on, like the fact that talking to NPCs is just as funny as it was before, but it also still amounts to very little, so I can see a lot of people unfortunately passing up some of these funny conversations because they're just looking for items, and once they figure out that they're not going to find any, they just sort of stop. But really what it comes down to is despite the negatives that weren't improved upon or were introduced in the Demo 2, the game is still fantastic, and it's still far, far and above better than a vast majority of games on the platform. I stand by the fact that Blocktails got absolutely snubbed, and there is zero reason that this shouldn't have been nominated somewhere in the shitty-ass Innovation Awards. You know, we're putting the strongest battlegrounds in the strategy game category for some ungodly reason, but Blocktails doesn't get put anywhere. That makes a whole lot of sense. Anyways, we're going to be wrapping up this video. If you haven't played Demo 2 already, I would recommend it. It's 3 hours of fun that, well, if you enjoyed the first set of the demo, you're going to enjoy the second one. And with all that, we're done here. So if you enjoyed the video, you can leave a like and subscribe. If you didn't, don't. And with all that being said, have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you guys next time.